Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we are changing the mental health narrative, bringing hope and solutions. Here's your host, Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist.
Jim Gottstein grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. After graduating from West Anchorage High School in 1971, he attended the University of Oregon and graduated with honors, a Bachelor of Science in Finance, in 1974. From there, he attended Harvard Law School, graduating in 1978 with a J.D. degree. And in late 2002, Mr. Gottstein founded the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights, psychrights.org, whose mission is to mount strategic litigation campaigns against forced psychiatric drugging and electroshock across the United States. Jim has made addressing the alarming and horrific increase in the psychiatric drugging of children and youth a high priority. Well, so Jim, thank you so much for being here today. It's a pleasure to finally meet you face to face.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
I was hoping you could start us off by telling us a little bit about how you got into the work you're doing and what drives your passion for it.
Well, I was I was out of law school, been practicing for a few years, and got myself into a situation where I didn't sleep. And I've subsequently learned that anybody will become psychotic, which I prefer the term crazy, if they get sleep deprived enough. And I'm not particularly tolerant of sleep deprivation. Anyway, so I went crazy. I couldn't sleep. I had just laid down. I went over to my dad's house and laid down in a bed there. And I'd just fallen asleep for maybe a second. And I woke up and heard the devil coming down the hall. So it was a second floor bedroom, and I ran over the window and looked down, in which I knew what I'd see. But anyway, there's a lawn, but a little sidewalk there. And I thought, well, if I miss the sidewalk, I know how to do a parachute landing fall. So out I went. I did a parachute landing fall. I was fine. I was in my underwear. It was about 1 a.m. in the middle of June in Anchorage, so it was light, and ran across the street into this parking lot, and the devil was, behind me. So I kept looking around my shoulder, and so I was spinning around, and they dragged me and took me to the hospital and pumped me full of something to make me sleep. I woke up and there was this male nurse or something, some kind of the hospital staff with a clipboard sitting at the end of my bed, and he says, "What day is it?" And I said, "How long have I been asleep?" So he wrote down, it wasn't oriented to time, right? And things, went downhill from there. I was used to being able to make my own decisions. I had no idea this could happen to me. They told me that I would never get better. Those that believed I was a lawyer said I would never do that again. And when I told them I had graduated from Harvard Law School, that confirmed that I was delusional. And so I was really lucky not to have been made permanently mentally ill by this system, because that's basically what the neuroleptics, which are kind of marketed as antipsychotics, do, is they really dramatically worsen outcomes. And so after that, to get around to answering your question, is it changed my priorities, and I tried to help someone else.
If I remember from your story, you had a rough ride of it for a while, but then you found a psychiatrist that said, "Hey, wait a minute. Anybody that's sleep deprived long enough is going to have difficulty telling, the fantasy from the reality." And now you're maintained on just getting better sleep and using a sleep medication if you need it. Is that correct?
Right. And I really try and do things in a way so I don't get into that situation. So The drug I like is Halcyon, which is a benzodiazepine. But I can go a year, and I think it's maybe been 2 years since I've had any. And it's not unusual for me to go a year. And if I get to where I think I know I'm in trouble, it's not that difficult to tell that I'm getting, close to getting in real trouble, then I'll take it to get one night's sleep, usually just one night, and that breaks the cycle. But one of the things I do is what happens to me is that, I'm on a deadline and I'm on a project and I don't have it all figured out. And so I can't stop thinking about it. And so I usually file my briefs a day early, and which is pretty unusual for a lawyer because you can always make it better. But I like to think I get it to where I think it's good enough, and I like to think, my good enough is pretty good. So just different strategies to make sure that I don't get into that situation. And, one of the things that I write about in my book, the Zyprexa Papers, is how those kind of cases are kind of tailor-made to, to present problems for me.
The kinds of cases that you take are going to be so demanding of your time that it's going to push you to not have enough hours in the day kind of thing. Is that what you mean?
Right. The involuntary commitment and forced drugging hearings, they want to have them really fast. I mean, when the hospital files them, often they'll file them in the morning. This is mostly past tense anyway, but they'll file the petitions in the morning, and then they want to have that hearing that afternoon. And, it's ridiculous to think about doing a court case that fast.
Or being able to mount a defense in that period of time would be impossible.
Correct. And so I tell any potential client, I'm not going to do that. But they have to be done pretty fast. I think it's not allowed to be delayed more than a week. And the idea is you've got someone locked up and they should have a judicial determination that the state's entitled to have them locked up, pretty quickly. That's the idea. But the reality is that the legal process is pretty much a sham, except when I do it.
Well, and you detail that beautifully in the book, the Zyprexa Papers, and it's a compelling story about this particular individual that you're trying to help, and it's also a compelling story about the drug companies and the legal process. So, how soon after your own run-in with the legal system and having your rights denied and having forced medication, how soon after that did you start advocating for patients?
Well, pretty quickly, really. In fact, I mean, it depends how you look at it. I co-founded this organization called Mental Health Consumers of Alaska pretty soon after that. But the big thing that got me into legal representation was I read Bob Whitaker's book, Mad in America, which is really a terrific book, a great read in 2002. And to me, it was in addition to being such a good book, it was a litigation roadmap on how to challenge forced drugging based on it not being in the person's best interest rather than, civil rights or, civil liberties or that kind of thing. And before that, I didn't feel like I had anything, particularly unique to offer in the fight against it. But once I read Mad in America, I thought, this is something I could really do. And I founded the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights, Psych Rights, at the end of 2002. And then went forward from there.
And people can find that at psychrights.org.
Correct.
PSYCHRIGHT.org or RIGHTS. So that began it. And then what's been the trajectory of that, of Psych Rights and your advocating for patients?
Well, pretty soon after that, really before I was ready, someone that I knew by the name of Faith Myers got scooped up, and she asked me if I could, represent her and help her from being forced drugged. And that was in March of 2003. And I read about that a little bit in the book, but that was quite a story in itself. And what the Alaska statutes say is if the person is found to be incompetent to decide whether or not to, decline the drugs, then the hospital got to do whatever it wanted. And what I said is, hey, wait a minute, that's not constitutional. They have to at least show that it's in the person's best interest and there's no less intrusive alternative. And we won that at the Alaska Supreme Court, although they took a long time until 2006. 2007, I won a case at the Alaska Supreme Court on involuntary commitment, where in order for the state to be allowed to lock someone up, they have to find that the person, is, quote, mentally ill or something like that. And as a result, a danger to self or others. And that danger to self can be that you're so unable to take care of yourself that they call it gravely disabled. And the Alaska statute said that you could be locked up for being gravely disabled if serious illness, injury, or death was highly probable. And I go, well, that's probably okay. But then the other one said that your previous ability to function independently in the community will deteriorate. And I go, no, I don't think that's constitutional. And we took that up to the Alaska Supreme Court, and they agreed it was not constitutional and that you could only lock someone up for being gravely disabled if they were unable to survive safely in freedom. I'm not entirely, and they said it a couple different ways. There have been a couple other cases, and one of the really important ones was Bill Bigley versus Alaska Psychiatric Institute. And of course, Bill was a person for whom I subpoenaed the Zyprexa Papers and you talked about. And in the Myers case, the Supreme Court said it had to be in the person's best interest, and there are no less intrusive alternative available. So, what does available mean? And so in Bigley, they said available means feasible, and they had to provide it or let the person go. And a couple other things is they didn't give me the Bill's hospital records until the day of the trial. And the Supreme Court said that was a denial of due process and some other things in that case. I think I'm losing you. But one of the important things was that I said you had to, in the petition to drug someone against their will, you had to put in, sufficient information to establish that you had the right to do that. And they agreed with that.
Well, and the other thing is one of the biggest pieces that gets glossed over when the hospital wants what's convenient is there a less intrusive means to keep the person safe? And so that was one of the things that you were talking about quite a bit in the Zyprexa Papers in those cases that you talked about. And that's where I saw your role as advocating so highly.
Right. Well, I got to know Bill pretty well, and he made people uncomfortable in the community, let us say. He would never was violent. And one of the grounds for the state gave for locking him up was that he was, so unpleasant that people would assault him. They would get assaulted. And so therefore they needed to lock him up, which I think is, pretty bogus.
That's if somebody assaults you, why isn't the person who's doing the assault having the problem? Right. So that.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I got to know Bill pretty well. And I put together this proposal for a less restrictive alternative. And the way it is, if for locking it up, they say locking someone up, they say it has to be less restrictive. And for forced drugging, they say it has to be the least intrusive. But in any event, for Bill, I put together this proposal for how to, manage things when, for him. And basically the hospital said, oh, no, we can't do that. And I never got it, but they ended up doing it, basically not being ordered to, but doing it on their own because it made so much sense. And that worked for, that actually really worked. And then
for Bill.
Yeah, it worked
for him.
Bill. Yeah.
Well, so at one point, because you were a patient advocate, somebody contacted you about subpoenaing the Zyprexa papers. Right.
So there was this giant lawsuit involving like 25,000 separate cases that was consolidated into one federal court in Brooklyn. It's called a multi-district litigation for discovery and settlement purposes. And this expert witness, David Eagleman, had access to these documents that he really thought the public should know about. And they were subject to a secrecy order. And the secrecy order said that if he was subpoenaed, he had to give Eli Lilly, the manufacturer of Zyprexa, notice and a reasonable opportunity to object before he complied with the subpoena. And so actually, Alex Berenson, the reporter at the New York Times, with whom he was working, went looking for someone he thought might subpoena him. And it turns out that in the Myers case, Dr. Grace Jackson had done a report on Zyprexa for Faith Myers. I think it was like olanzapine, which is a chemical name, dangerous drug, dubious efficacy. And I have a practice of basically posting everything on the web that we do in court if I can. And he found that report, and it picked up on the diabetes. She had freedom of information access documents that Eli Lilly had put in to the FDA to get it approved. So it really showed the diabetes and other metabolic problems. And she also revealed these, really the way they cooked the books on these studies. So, for example, one of the things they did is the control group was people who had been abruptly withdrawn from Haldol, which was one of the first generation neuroleptics. And it's well known that people that are abruptly withdrawn from Haldol experience, go crazy, get psychotic quite frequently. So that was a supposed control group, and they, and so that would make people on Zyprexa compare favorably. But then some people that get abruptly withdrawn from Haldol actually do quite well. And they threw them out of the study. They called it placebo washout. So that was one of the ways that they basically fraudulently conducted the studies. And another one was that they had this process they called last observation carried forward. Is so many people, this drug, Zyprexa, is so unpleasant and people weren't being forced to take it, that 60% of them dropped out because they couldn't be forced to take it. And so what they said was, we'll take where they were, their condition when they dropped out, and assume that's where they'd be at the end of the study. And that's called last observation carried forward. It's like, well, what's the point of doing a study if you're going to assume that the person's the same? Alex found that study and told Dr. Eagleman about it. And Eagleman called me and asked if I would subpoena them. And of course, I was pretty interested in doing that.
And of course, the things that you just mentioned were ways that the drug company changed the results they got in reporting to the FDA so that it would make Zyprexa look better.
Correct.
There was also this whole thing about, in the Zyprexa papers, all kinds of things that had been sealed under an order of secrecy that weren't really, they weren't proprietary company knowledge. They weren't, it was, I remember there were newspaper reports and all kinds of emails and things that had nothing to do with allowing Eli Lilly to keep their proprietary information and trade secrets about Zyprexa. It was about how dangerous the drug was and all the negative effects, and that was being hushed up because of this court order. Is that correct? Do I have that right?
Right. Well, I mean, they had reason to, keep the really negative information secret. I'm not saying that they should be allowed to, but they had reason to. But basically, the secrecy order said they had that in order to designate something as secret, it had to, be a legitimate designation, and there's certain criteria like trade secrets, embarrassment, some things. But just for convenience, they designated everything as secret. And there was really no one to object to that. The plaintiffs' lawyers, they were mainly interested in, getting a settlement or winning. Settlement. And so, fighting over something that really didn't matter to them, it was very important to the public interest, but it didn't really help them to win their case. So it wasn't them who, they weren't interested in trying to fight that. And the judge is supposed to take that into consideration, but they don't have anybody that's arguing to keep this stuff to public. And so they're, if the parties before them, aren't complaining, the judges tend not to, go out and, but in essence would be throwing a monkey wrench into settlement negotiations.
So you got a hold of the papers because you had a client that you were working on. They wanted to forcefully detain him and forcefully give him medications he didn't want.
Well, actually, I got the call from Eagleman, and then I had to go find someone that, had an appropriate situation. And one of the things I did, and of course I write about all this in the book, is I wanted to make sure that was proper, that I could have, well, it's proper to, if you're a public interest lawyer, to go out and find a client for a particular purpose. But also for a subpoena, if I wanted to make them public, and I also had a legitimate purpose for subpoenaing them, was that all right? And it was, and it is. And so I decided I could go ahead and do it. And then I went out looking for someone who had an appropriate case. And I found that was kind of the whole story and adventure in itself, with the Assistant Attorney General threatening me that I was, violating professional standards and all that kind of thing. But I found Bill and then subpoenaed the papers for him.
When you got the papers, you did what you could to distill from them what might be useful for you in this case. And then you also went, because of the public need to know, or your assessment of their need to know, distribute them to people who might be of interest. What happened with...
So that's kind of, if you don't mind. So I knew, I expected when I subpoenaed the papers, the documents, that Lily would object, and I would be in court in Alaska arguing why my client was entitled to them, which was, under the Myers decision, which had just come out earlier that year, the state has to prove that it's in the person's best interest. And I'm entitled to have information that, would be relevant on that would show that it's not in his best interest. And that's what I expected to happen. But Lily was slow, and so I got the papers before they objected. But I knew that, once they got going, they'd be big and fast. And so as soon as I got them out to the New York Times, and I made DVD copies, and I got those in the mail. And I really didn't have a chance to look at them very much before I was ordered to return them. Because, Lily basically whistled up these federal judges to order me about.
And so eventually you got pretty solid evidence, if I'm clear on this, that there was a lot of harmful potential effects of Zyprexa, and it wasn't going to be in your client's best interest to be forced to take it.
Right.
And on top of that, then you were able to get the material, which is available, on the internet, about how unhealthy it can be to take this medication and how there's probably better options. And so that in a way, your advocacy efforts were multiplied many times over. So you weren't just advocating for Bill, you were advocating for anybody who might be forced to take this medication.
Right, and that was the main point. And actually, I was, I said right away I was ordered to return them, and I was enjoined from possessing. Well, I was, enjoined from further dissemination, and I had been ordered to return them. So what I know about the Zyprexa papers is basically what I've read in the papers and otherwise. But it's, if you're knowledgeable, and again, Bob Whitaker went through this in Mad in America, and then more globally in a later book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, it's actually well established how harmful these drugs are, how they worsen people's outcomes. But there's just so much money on the other side that information, doesn't get disseminated. And that's why it was so important that the New York Times did an expose on it.
And one of the things I really enjoyed about the book was that you followed up on Bill throughout and did the long-term picture for him and his life. And you continue to do the Psych Rights, the website, and the advocating. Is this the first book you've written, the Zyprexa Papers?
Yeah, I'm probably the only one. I mean, I felt at the time that it happened that it deserved, that I wanted to write a book about it. Just because I think it's, an incredible set of events. I think it's very interesting. And I think it's pretty important what's in it. So I always wanted to write the book, and then I had a point where I had the time to do it, and I did it.
And then the outcome for the drug manufacturer that produces Zyprexa, that's Eli Lilly, what can you tell us about that? What was the end result of cases that came against them related to this drug? Well,
so they settled with the plaintiffs in this multi-district litigation. There were kind of two big settles for $1.5 billion, of which I got none. And then the federal government, which under the whistleblower statute called QTAM, or the False Claims Act, got another $1.5 billion in criminal and civil penalties, also of which I got none of. And basically I ended up with $300,000. I think it was $300,000 in attorney's fees, which at the time I wasn't able to pay all of it, basically. In a lot of ways, that was just the cost of doing business for Eli Lilly. I mean, it costs virtually nothing for them to make the drug. At the time, they were selling $5 billion of it a year. And then, so again, this was just kind of...
And what year was that?
2006.
You put up, or you accumulated over $300,000 worth of lawyers' fees trying to defend yourself for what you were doing, which was basically whistleblowing, which was providing critical information to the public about a very dangerous medication, especially the long-term effects of this medication. And so I thank you for that, and for that kind of advocacy on a broader range. The other thing that was fascinating to me is that they weren't able to criminally charge you, that you did what you did within the confines of the law, so that what you did was legal.
Well, the Judge Weinstein, who's this legendary judge who passed away just this year, I think, early this year, he found that I had, quote, conspired to steal the documents. And that set me up for, criminal contempt, and Lilly threatened to go after my bar license. But what had happened, and that's one of the places where I screwed up in my testimony, partly because I was sleep deprived, is that when I went and met with Bill, I asked him to sign an authorization for release of information so I could get his records. And the hospital said, you can't do it, only his guardian can do that. So I was pretty sure he'd been given Zyprexa, but I didn't know for sure. And then, and at the time I testified, I thought I had testified that I was pretty sure he'd been given Zyprexa, but it's not in the transcript.
Right.
But I subsequently, so that's what one of the things that the judge and Lily really hammered on was, he wasn't even given Zyprexa. And so this whole subpoena was a sham. But within a couple of weeks of that, I had gotten his records, and he had actually been drugged against his will with Zyprexa a few days before I subpoenaed him. And he was drugged against his will with Zyprexa about a month later. Well, no, 2 months later. So, and of course, we told that to Lily. And so the picture looked a lot different. And the idea that they were going to come after me with criminal contempt didn't look so good. And basically, what they did, more, to my shame maybe, is it's fairly successfully, is they really tried to keep that hanging over my head as long as possible to minimize how much I was, talking about this stuff. So in the end, they never brought criminal contempt charges or any contempt charges. They never went after my law license. And I had actually talked to the bar counsel for the Alaska Bar Association to see what he thought about it. And he wasn't too worried about the whole thing anyway.
The lesson for those of us who might end up with a family member or ourselves in a situation like this is that you really do need good representation, and you really do need to understand that most of the medications that are given in a crisis situation are not intended for long-term consumption because, as Robert Whitaker has pointed out in 2 different books, there's a lot of evidence that says the longer you take these things, the more negative impact they have. I forget the statistics, but I think that you had noted something about shortened life expectancy, and then Bill's life actually panned out that way.
Yeah, well, in Bill's case, Grace Jackson, she graciously agreed to testify in his case too, and in 2007 testified that if he was continued to be drugged against his will, he would die within 5 years, and he did. Just basically a little over 5, in 2012. But also people diagnosed with serious mental illness in the public mental health system have a 20 to 25 year shorter lifespan. And it's basically due to the drugs. And because before the introduction of the drugs, people in mental hospitals had normal lifespans. So there was something else I was going to say.
Well, so people can find out more about what you do at psychrights.org.
Yeah, I remember what I was going to say, which is there are other things that people can do. You said like for short term, and maybe, some people could really use a benzodiazepine to reestablish sleep. That's what they did in a couple of these studies that really showed that if you can minimize who gets these neuroleptics when they first get introduced to the mental health system, you can basically have an 80% recovery rate, 80%. And what we're seeing in the United States, where we insist, where psychiatry or the system insists that people be on these drugs, basically forever, there's a 5 or 6% recovery rate. So it goes from 80% to 5 or 6% recovery rate. if you get put on these drugs forever. And then there was this other study that showed for people who were on these drugs and then got off of them, they had a 40% recovery rate. So, which is, 8 times better than, 7 or 8 times better
staying on them.
Than staying on them, but half as good as if you never got on them in the first place. So that's why it's so important not to get on these drugs, to avoid getting put on these drugs if you possibly can. And of course, none of this information is usually presented to the judges. You just have, the psychiatrists say how great these are and how much the person needs them. And the public defenders, which are kind of referred to as public pretenders, they're not really expected to
mount a defense.
To represent their clients. The way I look at it is their purpose is to check the box that the person had a lawyer.
Well, and with the caseload they've got and the money they're being paid, and it is a big glitch in the system, at to say the least.
Right, they're not allowed to do a good job. I mean, in Anchorage, when I was doing these, there were maybe 5 or so of these cases that get filed every Monday and Friday morning, I think it was, 2 times a week in the morning for trials that afternoon. And they did all those trials in that one day. And of course, there's no time to prepare. And it's a kangaroo court.
What we know, and you're talking about some studies where you've got an 80% recovery rate if you're not drugged against your will, and if you have some other more humanistic alternatives to this lockup and drug routine. I would just want to recommend Peter Breggin, and he wrote a book about withdrawal from psychiatric medications. And it's so important to come off of these in the proper way and slowly. And it's really good to have a medical doctor to help you supervise that. And that's what people say. Just say protect themselves. But what I'm saying is with somebody like Dr. Breggin's book, where here's a medical doctor and he's studied it and he says, look, you have to do this very, very slowly. And so if you go to your medical doctor and say, look, I want to do this, and they say, well, just cut it in half and cut it in half, that's probably not the best way to do it.
That's what I was going to say. Most doctors don't have a clue as to how to go about it. And they think you can just, get off very quickly.
But the studies show that when you come off quickly, you're subject to rebound and psychotic symptoms or worse symptoms than you had before, because there's a tremendous change in your brain chemistry that happens with these powerful medications.
Right. So the neuroleptics, for example, block 70 to 90% of the dopamine transmission in your frontal lobe, your basal ganglia, and your limbic system. I can tell you what all those do. But so what the brain does to compensate, initially, it pumps out more dopamine to try and compensate. But then with a continued blockage, it grows more dopamine receptors. So while there was never anything abnormal about the brain, that person's brain, before they start taking the drugs, once they've taken them for, say, 6 weeks or so, then they have more dopamine receptors. And so you have to come off slowly. And they can eliminate some of those receptors, and you're much more likely to be successful if you come off slowly.
And it's very individualized. So some people, as you said, in the Haldol situation, some of the people come off have pretty good results. A lot of them don't. And it's so individualized, and Dr. Breggin points that out in his book, that you really need to read your own body, and you need to be willing to work in titrating down very, very slowly if needed. So,
yeah, and it's really important. It's really good to have support when you're doing it. And Dr. Breggin's book on that is very good. I think it's called Withdrawal, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal.
Yeah.
And he's got his seminal book is called Toxic Psychiatry, which I think was published in the mid-90s. And he's got this other one called Your Drug May Be Your Problem, which is also a really good good book. It actually helped me once, where you can look and see what the adverse effects are, what the withdrawal effects are, so you can it helps you figure out what's going on. And then there's a free download, and there's a link to it on the homepage of psychrights.org, called The Harm Reduction Guide to Coming Off Psychiatric Drugs. And they're very similar. And one of the things that is striking about them is they both really emphasize the importance of being in a situation where you're likely, that enhances your prospects of being successful. And that includes having people who support it and having someone hopefully that you trust. And hopefully when you get into one of those states who says, okay, wait a minute, you're kind of getting a little dicey and maybe you should, go back up a little bit till you kind of stabilize or not go down anymore. But basically being in a place where
you have support.
You have support, and yes, exactly.
And the more knowledge that your support team has, the better. So that's why a lot of these peer groups and, those people who've had lived experience who are starting support groups and are trying to have early interventions for anybody who's had a psychotic episode, it's so important. And of course, the earlier the intervention, the better the prognosis. And I'm not talking about intervention with medications. I'm talking about discussion, support, keeping the person safe, finding out about the stressors, getting somebody who's educated in dealing with that. And whether it's a peer support level or a professional support level, it's really, really useful to have those pieces in place when you're going to come off these medications.
Correct.
So I have just a few minutes left here. What is something about your work, whether it's with Zyprexa Papers or Psych Rights or something else that we haven't covered yet?
Well, I think maybe what's going on with children, and especially foster children and youth, that they're just being drugged to the gills. I mean, someone goes into foster care and they're immediately given a mental health evaluation, which have like a 80% false positive result on that. And I was involved with a group called Facing Foster Care in Alaska. And I went to their retreat once, how many of them had been given psychiatric drugs, and every single person raised their hands. And so, children aren't the ones making the decisions. So they're basically always forced to take the drugs. But it turns out that most of the psychiatric drugs given to children are not properly reimbursed by Medicaid. And virtually all of the Medicaid, all foster children and youth are on Medicaid. And I mentioned this False Claims Act case for Zyprexa, but under the False Claims Act, anybody can sue on behalf of the government and share in the recovery, if any. And so on our homepage, we have this, I think it's called the Psych Rights Medicaid Fraud Initiative for the Drugging of Children and Youth. But basically, the idea is that, anybody can sue on behalf of the government and share in the recovery. And each prescription that's not allowed to be reimbursed is a false claim. And each false claim has a minimum penalty of $5,500. And any prescriber worth their salt would have done 1,000 of these in the 6-year statute of limitations. So that's $5.5 million. And the idea is to sue these, one or more of these prescribers to get, basically drive them, make them bankrupt and scare the other ones into stopping it. And I won in a Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals decision that our theory of this was correct, but it got screwed up on remand. And then none of the cases have really gotten to the end. But I still think it's a viable approach. And whether that approach or any other, the way that we are drugging foster children is really, I can't even describe. It's horrific. I mean, a child goes into foster care because there's been a determination that they've been subjected to abuse or neglect. Well, that's going to make a child act out in most cases, right? And then no matter how bad, some are glad to be taken away from their home, but most, it's pretty traumatic to be taken away from their home. And that's going to cause them to act out. And a lot of these foster homes are pretty terrible, and in various ways. And that can, cause problems and, have the children behave in ways that the adults don't like. And so what we do is we tell them, rather than help them deal with all this stuff, which is what we should be doing, we should help them deal with this stuff. And we should be helping parents be better parents, because most of the time, most parents are doing, the best that they can. Some are pretty terrible people, but mostly not. But instead of doing that, we tell the child that there's something wrong with their brain, and they're going to have to take these drugs that really disable them for the rest of their life, and that they're not responsible for their behavior, that it's their, quote, mental illness that is causing them to behave this way. So this is all exactly the wrong thing that we should than what we should be doing.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate the heads up on that. I think I talked to you about Martin Whitley in his book in Australia, trying to look at basically the same thing, the complete overprescribing for children on attention deficit disorder meds and things in Australia, that he's working on bringing awareness to that problem and trying to find some solutions. So,
right, I've ordered the book, but I haven't read it yet. I think it's, anyway, I've got it, or it's on order.
Well, I greatly appreciate your taking the time to talk to us about this. I thank you for your work with the Zyprexa Papers, and I hope people feel compelled to check you out at psychrights.org. And if you do come up with another book, I'd love to read it.
All right, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
Jim Gottstein grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. After graduating from West Anchorage High School in 1971, he attended the University of Oregon and graduated with honors, a Bachelor of Science in Finance, in 1974. From there, he attended Harvard Law School, graduating in 1978 with a J.D. degree. And in late 2002, Mr. Gottstein founded the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights, psychrights.org, whose mission is to mount strategic litigation campaigns against forced psychiatric drugging and electroshock across the United States. Jim has made addressing the alarming and horrific increase in the psychiatric drugging of children and youth a high priority. Mr. Gottstein is most known around the U.S. and internationally for subpoenaing and releasing the Zyprexa Papers in late 2006, resulting in a series of New York Times articles and an editorial calling for congressional investigation. In January of 2009, Eli Lilly pled guilty and agreed to pay $1.4 billion in civil and criminal fines for the activities revealed by the Zyprexa Papers. In 2020, Jim published his book, The Zyprexa Papers, giving a first-hand account of what really happened, including his battles on behalf of Bill Bigley, the psychiatric patient whose ordeal made possible the exposure of the Zyprexa Papers. Mr. Gottstein also devoted considerable time trying to make alternatives to psychiatric drugs available in Alaska through Sotera Alaska and Choices, Inc. You can see a report titled Multifaceted Grassroots Efforts to Bring About Meaningful Change to Alaska's Mental Health Program, and you'll see a description of these efforts.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.